December 9, 1944, 28,000 feet above the Austrian Alps. Captain Robert Williams pressed his oxygen mask tighter against his face as frost crept across the canopy of his P-51 Mustang. Below him, a formation of B-17 flying fortresses churned through the thin air toward a synthetic oil refinery near Vienna, their contrails writing temporary verses across the winter sky. Williams and his squadron, their aircraft painted with distinctive red tails that had become both badge and promise, maintained their protective weave above the bombers. The temperature outside hovered at 53 degrees below zero. Inside his heated flight suit, Williams could still feel the cold trying to penetrate through layers of leather and fabric. This was his 97th mission over territories controlled by the German armed forces during the war, and like the 96 before it, he flew knowing that the enemy pilots hunting these bombers had more respect for his skills than many of the officers back at his own base in Italy. What Williams could not have imagined then, as he scanned the horizon for threats and monitored his fuel gauges with practiced precision, was that within 18 months he would stand in his dress uniform at an airport in his home state of Alabama, having defended his country through 97 combat sorties, only to be refused access to the whites-only restroom, while European prisoners of that same conflict ate lunch inside the terminal restaurant. He could not have imagined that the nation he defended at 28,000 feet would deny him basic dignity at ground level. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the story of how the most successful fighter group in the entire European theater, men who proved themselves in the deadliest skies of the conflict, returned home to a nation that celebrated their victories while denying them basic dignity. It is a story of extraordinary courage, measured not just in aerial combat, but in the quiet determination to maintain honor and humanity in the face of systematic injustice. It is a story about the strange mathematics of valor, where 97 missions over enemy territory somehow calculated to less than access to a bathroom in your home state. Robert Marcus Williams had not planned to become a pilot. Growing up in Tuskegee, Alabama, during the 1920s and 30s, he had watched aircraft pass overhead with the same distant fascination that other children might regard ships on the horizon. They belonged to a world that seemed permanently closed to someone who attended a segregated school, drank from colored-only water fountains, and whose father worked 14-hour days as a mechanic for wages that would be considered poverty even by Depression-era standards. The Williams family lived in a four-room house on the colored side of town, where unpaved streets turned to mud every time it rained, and indoor plumbing remained a luxury for the few. Young Robert showed aptitude for mathematics and mechanical understanding from early age. His teachers at the segregated school, underpaid and working with donated textbooks that white schools had discarded, recognized something special in the quiet boy who could visualize three-dimensional problems and explain complex mechanical relationships with clarity beyond his years. By the time he reached high school, Robert was repairing neighbors' automobiles and farm equipment, understanding intuitively how engines breathed and gears meshed and systems connected. But in 1939, as conflict spread across Europe and whispers of war reached even the quiet streets of Tuskegee, something shifted in the national conversation. The Army Air Corps, under pressure from civil rights organizations and First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt herself, reluctantly announced the creation of an experimental program to train Negro pilots. The word experimental carried weight. It meant provisional, temporary, something to be tested and likely discarded when it failed to meet expectations. It meant the burden of proof rested entirely on the shoulders of those who volunteered. It meant that every mistake would be attributed not to individual shortcoming, but to racial inadequacy, every success dismissed as exception rather than rule. Williams was 22 years old when he saw the recruitment notice posted outside the colored YMCA in 1941. He had completed 2 years at Tuskegee Institute, studying mechanical engineering with the kind of focused determination that comes from knowing that every opportunity must be seized because the next one might never arrive. The notice promised flight training, officer commissions, and the chance to serve a nation that barely acknowledged Negro citizens as fully human. It did not promise respect, safety, or a future beyond the training itself. The fine print mentioned physical requirements, educational standards, and character references. It did not mention the psychological burden of representing an entire race every time you stepped into a cockpit. He applied anyway, along with 700 other young men from across the country. Some came from colleges and universities. Others had built their own aircraft or learned to fly at civilian schools that accepted Negro students. Many had never been inside an airplane, but possessed the kind of desperate hope that comes from living in a society that denies your potential at every turn. Only 33 were accepted into the first class. The selection process evaluated flying aptitude, educational background, physical conditioning, and something less tangible, the ability to endure pressure that would break most people. The Tuskegee Army Airfield, hastily constructed on farmland outside the town that gave it its name, became an island of possibilities surrounded by an ocean of segregation. The white commanding officers who oversaw the program arrived with skepticism etched into their operational plans. Many believed the experiment would fail, that Negro pilots lacked the intelligence, reflexes, or courage necessary for aerial combat. Some hoped it would fail, viewing the entire enterprise as political theater that diverted resources from real warriors. The training program was structured to be identical to white pilot training, which meant it was brutally difficult. The failure rate at other flight training facilities hovered around 40%. At Tuskegee, any failure rate above 10% would be cited as evidence of racial inferiority. Captain Noel Parrish, the white officer who became director of training in 1942, thought differently. A Kentuckian who had confronted his own prejudices through observation rather than ideology, Parrish watched the first classes of cadets and saw what others refused to acknowledge. These men flew with precision that matched or exceeded their white counterparts at other facilities. They absorbed technical instruction with remarkable retention, often scoring higher on written examinations than the instructors expected. They demonstrated courage by the simple act of persisting in a program designed, intentionally or not, to highlight their failures. When equipment malfunctioned, when weather turned dangerous, when training accidents occurred, the Negro cadets responded with the same professionalism as pilots anywhere. Parrish became an advocate, filing reports that contradicted the prevailing assumptions about Negro pilots. He requested better equipment, defended cadets against unjust accusations, and insisted that success or failure be judged by the same standards applied to white pilots. This made him unpopular with some superior officers who preferred confirmation of their prejudices over evidence that contradicted them. Parrish did not care. He had discovered something important through watching these men train. Competence recognizes competence, regardless of skin color. Williams remembered his first solo flight with the clarity of a photograph developed in perfect chemistry. March 23, 1942, in a PT-17 Stearman biplane that rattled and hummed like a living thing. The Stearman was a forgiving aircraft, stable and predictable, designed specifically for training pilots. It had a maximum speed of 124 miles per hour, a service ceiling of 11,300 feet, and handling characteristics that gave nervous students confidence. His instructor, a weathered veteran named Chief Anderson, who had been one of the first Negro pilots in the country, and who carried himself with the quiet dignity of someone who had fought battles most people never witnessed, stood beside the aircraft and offered final guidance. "Check your instruments," Anderson said, his voice carrying the particular timbre of someone who had said these words thousands of times, but meant them every time. "Trust your training. The aircraft wants to fly. Your job is simply not to prevent it from doing what it was designed to do." The engine roared to life with a cough of blue smoke and a crescendo of mechanical thunder. Williams ran through the pre-flight checklist one more time, checking magnetos, oil pressure, fuel levels, control surfaces. Everything showed green. He advanced the throttle, felt the Stearman begin to roll, gradually building speed across the packed dirt runway. At 60 miles per hour, he pulled back on the stick, and the wheels lifted from the red Alabama clay. The sensation was unlike anything he had experienced. Suddenly, the laws that bound humans to the surface released their grip. He was airborne, ascending through clear morning air, and for 8 minutes and 43 seconds, Williams inhabited a space where prejudice could not reach him. The sky did not care about the color of his skin. The aircraft responded to skill, not ancestry. The horizon welcomed him with complete indifference to his race. Finally, they received the aircraft that would become synonymous with their legend, the P-51 Mustang. The Mustang represented the pinnacle of American fighter design. Powered by a Packard-built Merlin engine producing 1,620 horsepower, the Mustang could reach speeds of 437 miles per hour and operate effectively at altitudes above 30,000 feet. With external fuel tanks, it possessed the range to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back, something no other fighter in the American infantry could accomplish. The Mustangs assigned to the 99th, 100th, 301st, and 302nd Fighter Squadrons, collectively known as the 332nd Fighter Group, received distinctive paint schemes. Their tails glowed bright red, earning them the nickname Red Tails from the bomber crews they escorted. The Red Tails flew differently. They understood that their primary mission was not to score aerial victories, but to ensure that the bombers reached their targets and returned safely. Every aircraft that dropped its ordnance contributed to shortening the conflict. Every crew that survived flew again the next day. The mathematics was simple: protect the bombers, win the strategic battle, regardless of individual glory. Margaret, you would not believe what I witnessed today. 6 of those red-tail fellows positioned themselves around our formation like a protective shell. When German fighters came at us, and there must have been 20 of them at least, those red-tail pilots did not go chasing after them for glory. They stayed right with us, intercepting only the attackers that posed immediate threats. I watched one of them, aircraft number 42 I think, execute a maneuver that seemed to defy the laws of physics. A German fighter had dived through our formation, attempting to break us apart. The Mustang pilot rolled his aircraft completely upside down, then pulled into this screaming dive that must have subjected him to forces that would knock most men unconscious. He positioned himself directly behind the attacking aircraft and fired 3 very short bursts. The German aircraft started trailing smoke and spiraled away. But here is the remarkable part. The Mustang pilot did not chase after it to confirm the victory. He climbed right back to his position above us and resumed his protective pattern. That pilot valued our safety more than his own recognition. I have never seen anything like it. It created tension in the command structure that rippled through briefing rooms and officers' clubs. White fighter groups with proud traditions and ace pilots found themselves overlooked in favor of the Negro pilots they had assumed would wash out during training. Some protested formally, filing complaints about favoritism and suggesting that the statistics must be manipulated. Others quietly admitted, usually after several drinks and only among trusted friends, that if they were flying into the most heavily defended airspace in Europe, facing hundreds of anti-aircraft guns and experienced enemy pilots flying advanced aircraft, they too would want the red tails on their wing. The formation encountered weather that meteorologists had failed to predict or perhaps had predicted, but the prediction had not reached the pilots in time. Clouds built into towering thunderheads that reached above 35,000 feet, massive structures of frozen water vapor that generated their own internal weather systems. Ice accumulated on the wings faster than the deicing boots could cycle, faster than the heated leading edges could melt. Williams felt his Mustang become sluggish, the controls requiring more force, responses coming slower. Below him, bombers fought the same battle against nature that cared nothing for human conflict or ambition. Several aircraft had already turned back, unable to continue through the ice and turbulence. Others struggled onward, determined to reach their assigned target despite conditions that made flying itself an act of courage. Williams counted 6 attackers initially, then revised his estimate upward to 8, maybe 10, hard to be certain in the chaos of clouds and ice and aircraft moving at high speed through 3-dimensional space. His wingman, Lieutenant James Carson from Detroit, who had played college football before the conflict and brought that same competitive intensity to aerial combat, called out positions over the radio in a voice tight with stress, but still controlled. 2 bogies high at our 3 o'clock, Carson reported, using the brevity code that compressed threat information into minimal words. Another pair low at 9 o'clock. They are setting up for a coordinated attack on the bombers. The bombers were breaking formation, each pilot fighting for survival in the turbulence, the careful defensive boxes that provided mutual protection coming apart like paper in wind. This was exactly what the German pilots wanted: isolated targets that could be engaged without facing concentrated defensive fire from multiple aircraft. Williams positioned himself in the classic 6 o'clock high position, slightly above and directly behind the German fighter, the blind spot that every pilot feared. He thumbed the gun switch, felt the Mustang shudder as 6 .50 caliber machine guns fired, watched tracers arc across the winter sky in bright lines of destruction. The combined fire rate was 4,800 rounds per minute, meaning that even a 3-second burst put 240 rounds into the air. The German pilots saw the tracers, saw death approaching, and rolled away hard, trying to escape into the clouds. Williams followed, inverted, pulling hard on the stick, feeling the G-forces drag at his consciousness like hands pulling him down into darkness. His vision narrowed to a tunnel, grey creeping in from the edges, but his hands remained steady on the controls. Years of training, hundreds of hours in the cockpit, muscle memory built through repetition until actions became automatic. Instead of pressing the attack, instead of following to confirm the victory and claim credit for a confirmed aerial destruction, Williams broke off. The bomber was safe. His job was done. The mission called for protection, not glory. He climbed back toward the formation, found Carson still weaving protectively above 3 B-17s, and resumed his assigned position. Williams landed with ice still clinging to his wings, chunks breaking off and scattering across the runway as the wheels touched down. His fuel gauge showed less than 15 gallons remaining, enough for maybe 8 more minutes of flight. The crew chief, who inspected his aircraft, later found bullet holes in the tail section that Williams had not even noticed during the flight, evidence of how close the German fighters had come. That evening, in the officers' quarters that remained segregated, even on the Italian airbase where they all faced the same enemy and flew the same dangerous missions, Williams wrote in his diary. The entry was brief, factual, without drama or embellishment. Mission 69 complete. Encountered enemy aircraft in severe weather conditions. Formation protected. All bombers under direct escort returned safely. Aircraft sustained minor damage. Ammunition expenditure approximately 400 rounds. He did not mention the fear, the way his hands had trembled for 20 minutes after landing, the vivid image of that Fokker wolf rolling away trailing smoke, the realization of how close the bullets had come to his own aircraft. The conflict did not care about fear, it cared about results. The bombers had reached their target. The crews would fly again tomorrow. That was what mattered. But alone in his bunk that night, listening to other pilots sleep or write letters or play quiet card games, Williams allowed himself to process the day's events. He thought about the German pilot he had engaged, wondered if the man had survived, wondered what circumstances had brought him to this point of flying for a regime built on hatred and conquest. He thought about the bomber crews whose faces he would never see, but whose lives had depended on his skill and dedication. He thought about the contradiction of fighting for a nation that would not allow him to sit in the same officers' club as the white pilots he flew beside. These thoughts were not new. Every mission brought them to the surface. Every time he climbed into the cockpit wearing the uniform of a country that denied his humanity, he confronted the paradox. Why fight for a nation that treats you as inferior? Why risk your life defending people who would deny you basic dignity? The answer was complex and evolved over time. Initially, Williams had hoped that exceptional service would earn recognition and respect, that proving himself in combat would change minds and open doors. He learned slowly that excellence was not enough, that no amount of courage or competence would alter beliefs rooted in something deeper than evidence or logic. But he continued flying anyway, for reasons that shifted but never disappeared. He flew for the bomber crews who depended on him. He flew for the other Negro pilots who needed him to succeed, so their own successes would be possible. He flew because quitting would confirm the prejudices of those who wanted him to fail. He flew because at 28,000 feet for brief periods, he inhabited a space where only skill mattered. By April 1945, as the conflict in Europe entered its final weeks with the German military collapsing under combined pressure from east and west, Williams had flown 97 missions. He had personally accounted for 4 confirmed aerial victories and shared credit for 3 others. The confirmed victories meant enemy aircraft witnessed crashing or seemed to be abandoned by their pilots. The shared credits represented aircraft that multiple pilots had engaged, making individual attribution impossible. But these numbers, while noted in official records, meant little compared to the larger statistic. Not a single bomber under his direct protection had been lost to enemy fighters. 0 perfect. Eleanor Roosevelt visited the base in Italy during April 1945, just weeks before the conflict ended. She walked among the aircraft, touched the red tails that had become symbols, shook hands with pilots and ground crews. Photographers captured images that would appear in Negro newspapers across America, visual evidence that these men existed and excelled. Mrs. Roosevelt spoke briefly, praising the courage and competence of the Tuskegee Airmen, noting that they had proven something important about American character and capability. The situation was worse stateside. When several red-tail pilots attempted to enter the whites-only officers' club at Freeman Field in Indiana during a stateside training rotation in April 1945, they were arrested and threatened with courts-martial. Over 100 officers participated in the protest, refusing to sign regulations that formalized segregation. The situation escalated to the War Department, creating embarrassment for military leadership. Eventually, the charges were dropped and the regulations modified, but the message was clear. Excellence in combat did not translate to equality at home. Williams thought about this contradiction constantly during the long flights over territory, where every minute brought potential combat. He thought about it during the hours of boredom punctuated by seconds of terror. He thought about it when he watched bomber crews wave gratitude from their gun positions, when he heard radio transmissions thanking the Red Tails for protection, when he returned to base and walked past the Whites-Only Club. At 28,000 feet, where oxygen was scarce and temperatures could freeze exposed flesh in seconds, where enemy fighters hunted with lethal intent and anti-aircraft fire filled the sky with steel fragments, Williams was an equal. His skin color meant nothing to the Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts he faced. The German pilots trying to destroy him cared only about his skill and his aircraft's capabilities. In combat, he was judged purely on competence. At ground level, he became something less in the eyes of the system he served. The meals were served in shifts, segregated. The recreation areas were divided. The small indignities accumulated like compound interest, each one adding to the weight of realization that nothing had fundamentally changed. Williams stood on deck during the Atlantic crossing, watching the ocean roll past in endless gray waves, and understood with painful clarity that he was returning not to the nation he had defended, but to the nation that had always existed, one that celebrated his victories while maintaining the systems that denied his humanity. The sergeant never made eye contact. It was as if Williams's combat record, his officer rank, his achievements existed in a different dimension that did not intersect with this moment. The 97 missions over enemy territory meant nothing here. The bombers he had protected, the aerial victories he had earned, the courage he had demonstrated all existed somewhere else, recognized in official records but irrelevant to immediate circumstances. Williams wanted to say something, to object, to assert his dignity, to force this young sergeant to acknowledge what he had done and who he was. Instead, he said, "Yes, Sergeant, I understand," and walked toward the colored section of the terminal. He had learned that some battles could not be won through confrontation, that preserving energy for fights that mattered meant accepting temporary indignities. Other Negro veterans filled the colored car, men returning from combat in Europe and the Pacific, men who had served with distinction and courage, men who now returned to a nation that would deny them jobs, housing, education, basic dignity. They spoke quietly among themselves, sharing experiences, making plans, supporting each other in ways that white veterans would never need to depend on their fellows. There was camaraderie here born from shared struggle, bonds formed not in foxholes, but in the everyday resistance to dehumanization. He believed these things deeply. Education had opened doors for him that would otherwise have remained permanently closed. Perseverance had carried him through training and combat and endless discrimination. Dignity was the armor he wore against a world that tried constantly to strip it away. He also believed these things should not require such extraordinary effort, simply to be recognized as human. The baseline should be equality, with excellence built upon that foundation, rather than excellence being the price demanded just to approach that foundation. Williams drove himself in a used 1938 Ford Coupe that he had purchased with carefully saved pay from his service. The drive took 47 minutes along Highway 80, a two-lane road that connected Tuskegee to Montgomery through farmland and small towns. The Ford ran well, engine smooth, but the car showed its age in worn upholstery and paint faded by Alabama sun. The Montgomery Regional Airport was a modest facility that served commercial and military traffic. The main terminal, constructed in the late 1930s, was a single-story brick building with large windows and a control tower rising from one end. The facility handled perhaps 20 flights daily, mostly DC-3 aircraft carrying passengers to Atlanta, Birmingham, and Nashville. On this particular morning, the airport was quiet, with only a few people visible in the terminal. Williams parked in the colored section of the lot, an area marked by a hand-painted sign that informed Negro visitors where they belonged. The colored section was farther from the terminal, unpaved, without the landscaping that made the white section attractive. He walked toward the terminal carrying his orders and documentation in a leather portfolio that had accompanied him through 97 missions, survived the same dangers he had survived, and now held papers that should have guaranteed him benefits, but might not because skin color mattered more than service record. Williams headed for the colored restroom without considering any alternative. He had learned long ago to navigate these restrictions without expending emotional energy on battles that could not be won in the moment. He knew where he was permitted and where he was not. The knowledge was exhausting, requiring constant attention to signs and customs and unwritten rules that could change from one location to another. They were prisoners from the recent conflict, likely being transported between camps or awaiting processing for repatriation. The United States held thousands of German prisoners, men captured during the fighting in North Africa, Italy, France, and Germany itself. These prisoners were housed in camps across the country, including several in Alabama, where they worked on farms and in factories, doing labor that freed American workers for other tasks. The prisoners received treatment governed by the Geneva Conventions, which specified minimum standards for food, housing, medical care, and general welfare. Many German prisoners later recalled their captivity in America as surprisingly comfortable, noting that they ate better and lived better than they had in their own military. Williams stopped walking. He stood there for perhaps 30 seconds, perhaps a full minute, watching enemy soldiers eat lunch in a facility where he, a decorated American officer who had flown 97 combat missions defending his country, would not be permitted to sit. The scene arranged itself in his mind with crystalline clarity, every detail sharp and permanent. The German prisoners were young, probably in their early 20s, similar in age to the pilots Williams had faced over Austria and Germany and Romania. They ate with the casual ease of people who had accepted their circumstances and found them surprisingly tolerable. One of them laughed at something another had said. They seemed relaxed, comfortable, unthreatened. Williams had faced men like these in the sky. He had maneuvered against them, fired at them, seen them spiral away trailing smoke. They had tried to destroy the bombers he protected, had tried to destroy him. Their military had been built on principles of racial superiority and conquest. They had fought for a regime that considered entire categories of human beings subhuman and disposable. They had lost, America had won. And yet here, in this airport terminal in Alabama, these defeated enemy soldiers enjoyed privileges he was denied. They sat in the whites-only section because white was white, regardless of nationality or allegiance or recent combat against American forces. They could use any restroom in the terminal. They could eat in the restaurant. They could move through public spaces without constantly checking signs and customs and regulations. The absurdity of it hit Williams with physical force, like turbulence encountered unexpectedly at high altitude. The contradiction was so complete, so total, that it became almost surreal. He had defended this nation against these men. He had risked his life repeatedly to protect American lives, and American interests against the military forces they represented. He had succeeded, completing 97 missions without losing a single bomber under his direct protection, and his reward was to be denied access to a bathroom while enemy prisoners ate lunch where he could not sit. A white airport employee, seeing Williams standing motionless in the middle of the terminal, approached and asked if he needed directions. The man was perhaps 50 years old, wearing the grey uniform of airport staff, carrying a clipboard. His tone was not unkind, simply matter-of-fact, the voice of someone performing routine customer service. Williams turned to look at him, and the employee followed his gaze to the restaurant, to the German prisoners, and understanding dawned across his face. There was a moment of uncomfortable silence, both men recognizing what Williams was observing, both men knowing what it meant, neither sure what to say about it. Then the employee said something that Williams would remember for the rest of his life, would turn over in his mind during the decades that followed, would cite in speeches and interviews as encapsulating everything wrong with the system he had served. Williams had heard similar statements from German prisoners during interrogations after capture. They had not made the rules either. They had just followed them, following orders, following rules. Following customs became the excuse for perpetuating any system, no matter how unjust. Williams looked at the employee for a long moment before responding. "I know," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weariness of someone who had heard this excuse too many times. "I follow rules too. I followed them over Austria and Germany and Romania. I followed them when they said where I could eat and sleep and train. I'm still following them now." The face that looked back wore captain's bars polished to a shine. It wore combat ribbons, the distinguished flying cross among them, colorful ribbons that represented specific acts of courage and achievement. It wore the uniform of the United States Army Air Forces, with pride despite everything. But it also carried the weight of profound understanding, acceptance of a truth he had been learning incrementally, but now grasped completely. The meeting about veteran benefits was cordial and ultimately unhelpful. The officials, white men who had not served in combat but held positions of bureaucratic authority, explained the various programs available through the GI Bill. Educational benefits covered tuition and provided stipends for living expenses while studying. Housing loans offered favorable terms for purchasing homes. Business assistance provided capital and guidance for starting enterprises. On paper, these benefits applied equally to all veterans. The officials in Montgomery did not explicitly state any of this during the meeting. They provided information about programs, handed Williams pamphlets and application forms, and wished him well in his transition to civilian life. They smiled and thanked him for his service. They praised the Tuskegee Airman's record. They did everything except ensure that he would actually receive the benefits he had earned. Williams left the meeting with a folder full of papers and a clear understanding of what would happen next. He would apply to universities and receive rejections or silence. He would seek housing loans and face denials. He would navigate a system designed to appear fair, while operating to maintain existing hierarchies. He would encounter the GI Bill's promise and its reality, the gap between what was written and what was practiced. Williams eventually enrolled at Tuskegee Institute, pursuing a degree in mechanical engineering from the same institution where he had started before the conflict. It was a fine school, proud and accomplished, with faculty who understood the challenges their students faced and prepared them accordingly. The education was rigorous and relevant, but it was also the only option available to him in Alabama. Not the best option, not his preferred option, but the only option. Choice requires alternatives. Williams had none. Williams thought about this paradox constantly during the months and years after his return. He had imagined, during the long flights over enemy territory, that his service might change something. He had believed that demonstrating excellence under the most extreme conditions would earn recognition that transcended race. If a Negro pilot could protect bombers over Berlin, could score aerial victories against experienced German pilots, could complete 97 missions without major error, surely that would force reconsideration of the assumptions that justified segregation. But something else was happening too, something that would take years to fully manifest, but was already beginning. The Red Tails had proven something that could not be unproven. demonstrated something that could not be undemonstrated. They had shown in the most public and undeniable way possible that Negro Americans could perform at the highest levels in the most demanding circumstances. Every mission flown, every bomber protected, every aerial victory stood as evidence against the lies that justified segregation. Other bomber crew members did the same. They spoke at veteran gatherings, sharing their experiences with audiences who had not considered that Negro pilots might be defeated or courageous. They insisted that the finest fighter pilots they had encountered wore red tails and dark skin. It was not a flood of advocacy, but it was steady and genuine, testimony from white veterans who had depended on Negro pilots for their survival, and could not reconcile that experience with the segregation they had accepted previously. Williams watched these developments with cautious hope, tempered by experience. He had learned not to expect rapid change or easy victories. Progress, he understood, would be measured in inches and years, not miles and months. Every small advance would be contested. Every gain would require sustained effort to maintain. The forces opposing equality had power, resources, tradition on their side. Change would come slowly, incrementally, with setbacks and disappointments outnumbering victories. He married Dorothy Simmons in June 1950. She was a teacher at a Negro elementary school in Cleveland, educated at Fisk University, committed to education as both profession and civil rights strategy. They met at a church social, talked for hours about their experiences and dreams and frustrations with a system that limited them in countless ways. Dorothy understood what Williams had faced during the conflict and after. Her father had served in the First World War, had returned to face similar discrimination, had built a life despite constant barriers. She brought her own strength and determination to the marriage, her own understanding of what resistance looked like in daily life. The harassment began within weeks. Someone threw rocks through their front window on a Saturday night. Someone else painted slurs on their garage door. Cars would slow down when passing the house, occupants staring with undisguised hostility. Dorothy received anonymous phone calls suggesting they would be happier somewhere else, somewhere with their own kind. The police responded to their reports with professional courtesy and complete ineffectiveness. They took notes, filed papers, and did nothing substantive to stop the harassment. Williams considered moving, considered retreating to a neighborhood where they would face less hostility. But retreating meant accepting that they did not belong, meant allowing intimidation to succeed, meant giving ground in a battle that extended far beyond one house on one street. They stayed. They reinforced the windows, installed better locks, documented every incident, and refused to abandon the home they had earned through hard work and savings. Through it all, Williams maintained his connection to aviation. He joined the Cleveland chapter of Negro Airmen International, an organization of Negro pilots who had served during the conflict or trained afterward. The group met monthly, sharing experiences, supporting younger pilots, advocating for opportunities in commercial and private aviation. Williams taught ground school classes, explaining aerodynamics and navigation and weather to young people who dreamed of flying. He occasionally rented small civilian aircraft when finances allowed, taking Dorothy for flights over Lake Erie, showing his children the world from above. Flying remained the space where he felt most free, most himself, most completely unburdened by the weight of discrimination. In the cockpit, the old certainties returned. Skill mattered. Preparation mattered. The aircraft responded to inputs without regard to the color of hands on the controls. The sky extended in all directions without signs designating which portions belonged to which races. For an hour or two, Williams could inhabit the world as it should be rather than the world as it was. In 1954, the Supreme Court issued its decision in Brown v. Board of Education, declaring school segregation unconstitutional. Williams read the decision carefully, analyzing its logic and scope, understanding both its significance and its limitations. The court had ruled that separate but equal was inherently unequal, that segregation itself inflicted harm, that no equality of facilities could remedy. This was important, fundamental even, a legal foundation for challenging segregation in all forms. But Williams understood the decision was a legal victory, not a social transformation. Implementation would be contested at every level. School districts would delay and resist. States would pass laws attempting to circumvent the ruling. Violence would be used to intimidate families who tried to integrate schools. The battle had just begun, not ended. Legal right meant little without practical power to enforce it. The 1960s brought accelerating change and intensifying conflict. The civil rights movement gained momentum, organizing boycotts and sit-ins and freedom rides and mass demonstrations. Young people, black and white, risked arrest and violence to challenge segregation directly. Some gave their lives for rights that should never have required such sacrifice. Williams watched these developments with a complex mixture of admiration, concern, and reflection on his own generation's approach. He admired the courage of young activists who confronted injustice directly, who refused to wait patiently for change that might never come. Their willingness to face police dogs and fire hoses and vigilante violence demonstrated moral courage equal to anything he had witnessed in aerial combat. But he also worried about the costs they were paying, the psychological and physical trauma that came from constant confrontation with hatred. His own generation had chosen different tactics, seeking to prove competence and earn recognition through excellence rather than demanding rights through protest. The Tuskegee Airmen had flown perfectly, protected every bomber, demonstrated undeniable skill. Williams had endured discrimination without public complaint, maintaining dignity through quiet resistance. These approaches had achieved results, opened some doors, changed some minds. But the progress had been slow, incremental, limited. Perhaps more direct confrontation was necessary after all. When called upon, Williams spoke to groups about his experiences as a Tuskegee Airman. Civil rights organizations invited him to fundraisers and rallies. Schools brought him to talk to students about history and perseverance. Churches asked him to speak about faith and service. He accepted many of these invitations, recognizing that his story carried weight, that younger generations needed to understand both what had been accomplished and what remained unfinished. His speeches followed a consistent pattern. He described the training at Tuskegee, the skepticism they faced, the determination required to persist. He detailed the missions over Europe, the technical challenges of high-altitude combat, the responsibility of protecting bomber crews who depended on them. He emphasized the camaraderie among the Red Tails, how they supported each other through shared struggle. He spoke with quiet pride about their combat record, the 200 missions without losing a bomber, the distinction of being the most sought-after escorts in the theater. Williams always concluded these speeches with the same themes. Bitterness was exhausting and ultimately unproductive. Anger was understandable, but must be channeled into action rather than allowed to consume energy. Excellence remained important, not because it guaranteed reward, but because it opened possibilities for others. Each generation built on foundations laid by those who came before. Incremental progress across decades rather than dramatic transformation in moments. By the 1970s and 80s, Negro officers commanded squadrons, wings, entire bases. Some reached flag rank, becoming generals responsible for thousands of personnel and billions in equipment. Their success would have been impossible without those 97 missions over territory controlled by the German military during the conflict, without the undeniable record established in skies that measured only skill. Retirement brought freedom to focus on advocacy and historical preservation. The Tuskegee Airmen were receiving increasing recognition during the 80s as historians examined the conflict more thoroughly and civil rights activists highlighted examples of Negro achievement that had been overlooked or minimized. Documentary filmmakers interviewed survivors, capturing their stories before that generation passed. Museums created exhibits featuring the red-tailed Mustangs and the men who flew them. Schools incorporated the Tuskegee Airmen into curriculum about American history and the civil rights movement. Dorothy often accompanied him to these events, providing support and perspective. She understood better than most what the Tuskegee Airmen had accomplished and what it had cost them. She had lived through Williams's nightmares about combat, his struggles with a society that denied his worth, his persistent determination to maintain dignity despite constant affronts. She had raised 3 children while teaching full-time and managing a household and supporting her husband's advocacy work. Her contributions were essential, but often invisible, like so many women's contributions throughout history. In 2007, At a ceremony in the United States Capitol, Williams stood with other surviving Tuskegee Airmen as they received the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor Congress can bestow. He was 88 years old by then, his body showing decades of wear, but his mind remaining sharp and his memories vivid. The uniform from the conflict had long since retired, replaced by a civilian suit and tie. But someone had pinned his medals and ribbons to his jacket for the ceremony, physical symbols of service rendered 62 years earlier. A young reporter asked Williams afterward what he thought about receiving this honor 62 years after the conflict's end. Williams considered the question carefully before answering, choosing his words with the precision he had applied to everything throughout his life. He paused, then added something that surprised some listeners. "I want people to know that the struggle continues. We open doors, but doors can close again without constant vigilance. We proved that Negro pilots could excel, but that proof must be repeated in every generation, in every field, because prejudice does not die easily. It adapts, finds new expressions, persists in subtle forms even when explicit forms become socially unacceptable. Young people today face different challenges than we faced, but they still face challenges. They still need courage, persistence, dignity. They still need to fly their missions with excellence." Williams found his mind drifting during the speeches, returning to that September day in 1945, standing in the Montgomery Airport terminal, watching German prisoners eat lunch where he could not sit. He had spent 62 years processing that moment, understanding its layers of irony and injustice, working through anger and frustration and disappointment to reach something more complex and more sustainable. But the collapse was slow, taking decades rather than moments, requiring sustained effort from multiple generations. The work Williams and his fellow Tuskegee Airmen had done during the conflict proved necessary but not sufficient. They had demonstrated capability, but capability had to be repeatedly demonstrated. They had earned respect, but respect had to be continuously re-earned. They had opened doors, but keeping those doors open required constant vigilance. Williams passed away in 2012 at the age of 93, after a brief illness. Dorothy, his wife of 62 years, was with him at the end, holding his hand as he slipped away quietly in the early morning hours. His 3 children surrounded the bed, along with 7 grandchildren and 4 great-grandchildren, a family that would not have existed without his courage and determination to build a life despite every barrier placed in his path. His obituary appeared in newspapers across the country, from small local papers to the New York Times and Washington Post. The accounts detailed his combat record, his 97 missions and 0 bombers lost, his 4 confirmed aerial victories and 3 shared credits, his decorations including the Distinguished Flying Cross. They described his post-service career as an engineer, his advocacy for civil rights, his role in preserving the history of the Tuskegee Airmen. They quoted family members about his kindness and integrity, former colleagues about his technical brilliance, fellow Tuskegee Airmen about his leadership and skill. The airport bathroom was not mentioned in most obituaries, though Williams had spoken about it in countless speeches and interviews throughout his later life. The image of enemy prisoners eating where he could not sit had become central to his understanding of what the Tuskegee Airmen represented and what battles they had fought beyond aerial combat. Dorothy read all the obituaries carefully, collecting them in a scrapbook that joined dozens of others documenting her husband's life. She knew Robert would have appreciated the focus on achievements rather than grievances, the emphasis on what had been accomplished rather than what had been denied. But she also knew he would have wanted people to understand the full truth. Excellence had not protected him from discrimination. Courage had not earned him automatic respect. 97 combat missions had not guaranteed access to a bathroom in his home state. The Montgomery Airport, where Williams had been denied bathroom access, underwent major renovations in 2008, expanding to accommodate growing passenger traffic. During the renovation, the Historical Society successfully advocated for a marker near the terminal entrance, commemorating the role of segregation in the region's history and acknowledging the injustices committed in that building. The marker mentioned the Tuskegee Airmen specifically, noting that decorated combat veterans had been denied basic services at the facility while enemy prisoners received normal treatment. But the marker stayed, and every day Travelers pass it on their way into a terminal, where all bathrooms are open to all people, where restaurant tables carry no racial designations, where the explicit indignities of segregation have been relegated to history, if not to memory. Some travelers pause to read the marker, learning about a history they did not know. Others hurry past, focused on catching flights and making connections. Both groups live in a world shaped by the sacrifices of people like Robert Williams, whether they know it or not. The legacy of the Tuskegee Airmen extended far beyond aviation, rippling through American society in ways both visible and subtle. They demonstrated that when given equal opportunity and training, Negro Americans performed at the highest levels in the most demanding circumstances. This demonstration influenced President Truman's 1948 desegregation order, which influenced military leadership patterns, which influenced corporate hiring practices, which influenced educational access, which influenced social attitudes. The changes cascaded through decades, each generation building on foundations established by those 97 missions and thousands more like them. Williams understood this near the end of his life, could trace the connections between what he had done in the cockpit of a red-tailed Mustang and what young people could do in boardrooms and laboratories and courtrooms decades later. In one of his final interviews, conducted when he was 91 and already fighting the illness that would eventually claim him, he reflected on what the Tuskegee Airmen had accomplished and what it meant. "We flew," he said simply, his voice weakened by age, but still carrying conviction. That was revolutionary in itself. Negro men flying military aircraft, defending American interests, proving themselves in combat against one of the most formidable military forces in history. Every mission was a refutation of the lies that justified segregation. We did not set out to be civil rights pioneers. We set out to be pilots. We wanted to fly, to serve, to prove ourselves. But by being excellent pilots, by protecting those bombers, and completing those missions with a record that could not be dismissed or minimized, we became something more. We became evidence. The interviewer asked if he felt his service and the subsequent struggles had been worth it, given the slow pace of change and the discrimination that persisted, even after legal segregation ended. Williams took a long time to answer, his eyes focused somewhere beyond the room, perhaps seeing skies over Austria and Germany, perhaps seeing that airport terminal in Montgomery. Eventually, he said, every mission was worth it, because every mission mattered to the crews we protected. Those were real people with families and dreams, and a right to return home safely. Protecting them was always worthwhile, regardless of any larger significance. Every mission was worth it, because every mission proved we belonged in that sky, that we could meet the highest standards, that excellence had no color. As for the struggles after the conflict, those would have happened whether I flew or not. Segregation would have continued, would have been challenged, would have eventually fallen. Perhaps my service accelerated that timeline by some small amount. Perhaps it made the case for equality slightly more undeniable. That is enough. When pressed specifically about the airport bathroom incident, about the burning injustice of sitting in the colored section while enemy prisoners ate in the whites-only restaurant, Williams shook his head slowly. That moment clarified everything, he said. It showed me exactly what we were fighting against, and it was not just the armed forces controlled by a hostile foreign nation. It was the system that valued enemy soldiers above its own Negro citizens, that granted privileges based on skin color rather than service or character or humanity. That system was always going to fall eventually. It was built on lies, and lies cannot sustain themselves forever against accumulating truth. We flew 97 missions to prove the truth. Some people saw it immediately, others took decades. But the truth remained constant, waiting patiently for recognition. The interviewer's final question asked for advice Williams would give to young people facing injustice in their own time. Challenges different in form, but similar in essence to what he had faced. Williams smiled, the expression carrying both sadness for battles still necessary and hope for eventual progress. "Fly your missions," he said. "Whatever your missions are, fly them with excellence. Do not let others' prejudices limit your commitment to quality. Do not let discrimination become an excuse for mediocrity. Be better than the barriers they place in front of you, not to prove something to them, but to prove something to yourself and to clear the path for those who follow. Every excellent mission makes the next one possible for someone else. Every door you open, even slightly, makes it easier for the next person to push it wider. Excellence alone is not enough to guarantee justice, but without excellence, justice becomes even more difficult to achieve. Those were among his last recorded words on the subject of service, sacrifice, and the long struggle for equality. 3 months later, surrounded by family and fellow Tuskegee Airmen who traveled from across the country to say goodbye to one of their own, Robert Marcus Williams closed his eyes for the final time. The tributes that followed in newspapers and at memorial services emphasized his courage, his skill, his dedication to both country and principle. They were deserved tributes, earned through 97 combat missions and 67 years of continuing to fight for justice. But perhaps the greatest tribute was simply this. By the time of his death in 2012, Negro pilots flew in every branch of the military without restriction or segregation. Commanded squadrons and wings and entire air forces reached the highest ranks that military service could offer. They flew not as experiments or tokens or symbols, but as fully integrated members of the finest air force in the world. They flew because someone had to go first, had to endure the doubts and restrictions and indignities, had to be excellent when excellence was not sufficient, but remained necessary anyway. They flew because the sky, ultimately, measured only skill, and skill demonstrated through 97 missions over enemy territory, without losing a single bomber under direct protection, transcended every barrier that prejudice could construct. The red-tailed Mustangs are preserved in museums now, gleaming under climate-controlled lights, their paint carefully maintained to appear exactly as it did during the conflict. The Smithsonian Air and Space Museum displays one in its prominent World War II gallery. The National Museum of the United States Air Force at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio features several, positioned to show their distinctive markings. Smaller museums across the country, including the Tuskegee Airmen National Historic Site in Alabama, preserve these aircraft and tell the stories of the men who flew them. Visitors study these aircraft, read the educational placards explaining their technical specifications and historical significance, marvel at the courage required to fly these machines into combat against experienced enemy pilots flying equally capable aircraft. Children pose for photographs beside the landing gear, eyes wide with wonder, dreaming their own dreams of flight without the restrictions that limited previous generations. But the real legacy lives not in museums, but in the continuing work of breaking barriers, of proving excellence in the face of doubt, of maintaining dignity when dignity is denied. Every time a young person of any background climbs into a cockpit or pursues a dream that others claim is impossible, they carry forward the legacy established in the skies over Austria and Germany and Romania during those 97 missions. Williams would have appreciated that continuation. He understood that progress was not a destination, but a direction, not a singular moment of transformation, but a movement spanning generations. His 97 missions contributed to that movement. His quiet dignity in the face of injustice at the Montgomery airport contributed to that movement. His refusal to let bitterness consume his spirit or limit his effectiveness contributed to that movement. His willingness to share his story with younger generations, to explain both the victories and the defeats, to emphasize the importance of excellence and persistence, contributed to that movement. And that movement continues today, decades after his final flight, propelled by the undeniable truth he helped establish through skill and courage and determination, that excellence has no color, that courage has no race, that humanity transcends every artificial barrier constructed to divide people into categories of worthy and unworthy. The sky proved it, one mission at a time. 97 missions over enemy territory, 0 bombers lost, 4 confirmed aerial victories, 3 shared credits, Distinguished Flying Cross, Air Medal with 8 oak leaf clusters, decades of advocacy and education, a life lived with dignity, despite constant attempts to strip that dignity away. That was Robert Marcus Williams's legacy. That was the legacy of all the Tuskegee Airmen who flew those missions and fought those battles and opened those doors. They changed American history not through grand dramatic gestures, but through consistent excellence, not through single transformative moments, but through accumulated evidence that could not be dismissed or denied. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Do not forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.